Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Safer Consumer Products meeting. My name is Asha Sethi, and I'm a public participation specialist for the California Department of Toxic Substances Control. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're here to discuss the proposal to add microplastics to the candidate chemicals list. Today is the first day of the comment period, and it runs through July 27th. I'll be facilitating the public comment portion of this meeting and encourage you to provide us with feedback. Subtitles are available. Just click on the CC icon in the toolbar. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted on our website. Next slide, please. Now I'll go over how you can participate in this Zoom webinar. There's two ways. You can either type into the Q&A or raise your hand. Both those options are in the toolbar below. When you click the raise hand icon, we'll unmute you when it's your turn to speak. If you'd prefer to have your question or comment read out loud, you can click the Q&A icon and type it in there. For those calling in, dial *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute when it's your turn to speak. Next slide, please. I'll go over the agenda next. First, we have Carl Palmer, who's the Deputy Director of the program and will be providing opening remarks. Next, we have Rob Bruscia, who will be providing a presentation on the proposal to add microplastics to the candidate chemicals list. And then we'll have Valerie Hanley providing a toxicologist perspective on microplastics. After that, we'll open it up for public input, and we'll conclude with closing comments from Carl Palmer. That's it for opening announcements, and I'd like to hand it over to Carl.
Thank you, Asha. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this workshop. I'm happy to see everyone here today. I'm just going to give a really brief background and set up today's workshop. As all of you know, there's a lot going on in the microplastics world these days because people are concerned about the impacts of microplastics on our environment and our people. And this isn't a new discussion for us in the Safer Consumer Products program here at DTSC. If you recall, about a year and a half ago, we spoke to our Green Ribbon Science panel about our concerns with microplastics, and we had presentations then from Dr. Rob Bruscia of our staff, as well as our colleagues, Scott Coffin at the water boards, and our GRASS panelist, Dr. Suzanne Brander. And we had a really good discussion about where we were in the assessment of the potential harm that microplastics pose and what we might do about it. And we discussed our interest in perhaps listing microplastics as a candidate chemical in our Safer Consumer Products framework. And that's why we're here today. We also, soon thereafter, in February of 2022, California's Ocean Protection Council adopted our statewide microplastic strategy, which includes both near and long-term strategies for addressing the broad impacts of microplastics and things that we in California might do to go upstream, prevent this problem, as well as deal with the various aspects related to microplastics. So what we're doing today is part of that overall strategy in some sense, but it's really within our context of what we do in Safer Consumer Products. And I think it's important for us to understand that. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Just a really quick reminder that our Safer Consumer Products framework, in regulation has 4 key parts: the candidate chemical list, which is our menu of chemicals that we can regulate in our process; the selection of what we call priority products, products that contain one or more of those chemicals that pose some potential harm to people or the environment. The next phase is once we pick those priority products that we ask manufacturers to conduct an alternatives analysis or an alternative assessment to identify and evaluate potential safer alternatives. And ultimately, we can impose regulatory response conditions on those manufacturers that if they want to sell into California, they may have to either provide information, do further research, or change their product, or ultimately, if necessary, we can restrict or ban the sale of that product in California. But today's focus is really on that first part of the process. This is important because we have a tendency sometimes to want to rush to the solution. We're not there yet in our process. What we're talking about today is our proposal to list microplastics onto our candidate chemical list. And you'll hear in the workshop, our rationale for that and the impacts, as well as some other issues. So what we're hoping to do today is hear from all of you after you hear from us about our proposal, about what are your questions, what are your concerns, what are your recommendations, how do we move forward in this process so that we can put microplastics into our sites in our program and see what we can do about those problems. I will note that in our current priority products work plan, which was a 3-year period that we're just ending up on, we identified some of our policy priorities looking at products that generate microplastics. And we're going to this summer start the process of adopting our next priority product work plan, which will also identify the next categories of products that we're going to look at. This will start narrowing down our focus and put a little more context into how we're going to address microplastics. So stay tuned for that. Later this summer, we'll put out a draft work plan. We'll have another workshop. You'll have plenty of chance to give us input on that. But moving forward, it's really important that we hear from you. You're going to see today that there are a variety of ways that we can hear from you, both in today's workshop. We have a formal comment period starting today for a month that we'd love to hear from you on. And ultimately, once we get all that information, then we still need to go ahead and adopt in regulation the listing that would pull microplastics into our CC list. So there'll be another opportunity for comment. So it's not a quick process, but it's really important to us that we hear from everyone so that we can get as much information as we can to make good decisions moving forward. So with that, I thank you all for being here today. I thank you in advance for your input. And we'll just move right into our presentation. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Rob Bruscia from our team, who's going to tell us about our proposal. Rob?
Okay, thank you, Carl. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Excuse me 1 second. Sorry, there we go. Okay. So I'm going to talk about our proposal to add microplastics to our candidate chemicals list. And before I begin, I just want to say it's really gratifying to be here because this work has been going on now for a couple of years. Myself and some of my colleagues, who I'll talk about later, have been working on this for the last couple of years. And so seeing it finally move forward into a public comment period and to open it up for interaction with stakeholders is really, really great to be at this point. So, as Carl indicated, and as our title of our workshop indicates, we're here to talk about DTSC's proposal to add microplastics to our candidate chemicals list. And Carl kind of explained the significance of that, and that the candidate chemical list feeds into our process, so to speak, and that we select chemicals from the candidate chemical list and look at them in the context of consumer products to identify priority products. And so it's an important step in our process because we couldn't look at microplastics in products otherwise. So this is an important proposal. And the reason that we're here talking about this really is because microplastics are everywhere in the media and literally on the planet. They're everywhere you look, you find them. They're on the highest mountains, they're at the bottom of the deepest oceans, and they're in human blood. So we know that microplastics are in the environment, they're persistent in the environment, and that there are exposures to microplastics in the environment. And so we decided to take a look at microplastics a couple of years ago, started the scoping process, and developed this proposal. And I want to point out before I get going, it's really important to understand this proposal, if we did this, if we added microplastics to our candidate chemical list, would not in and of itself create any new regulatory requirements for any stakeholders. The only thing it would allow us to do is it would allow DTSC, as we said, to look at products that contain or release microplastics to the environment for the purpose of possibly identifying priority products. We don't have any products queued up right now. It's not, that's not the case. If we do go through this process and add microplastics to the candidate chemical list, it's going to take us approximately a year to do that. We then would have to start researching product categories and go through that whole process in order to identify those products that might contain or release microplastics. So it's a long-term process. It's nothing is going to happen in terms of actually identifying products that are of concern with respect to microplastics for at least a couple of years, probably. So before I get going, I just want to point out that our Safer Consumer Products regulation actually allows us to add chemicals to the candidate chemical list. It also allows us to take them away if we want to. But there are certain factors specified in the regulations that we have to take into account when we add when we propose adding chemicals to our candidate chemical list, and those factors are summarized here. Basically, they're their potential for adverse impacts and exposures, and then the extent of and availability of information related to these factors of adverse impacts and exposures. Okay, so these are the topics that I want to discuss with you today. I intend to summarize for you some of the information that we have on plastics and microplastics, what they are, and how we propose to define them for the purposes of our proposal. I would like to note that the background document for this meeting is available on our website, and I encourage you to look at it. What I'm presenting here is basically a summary of what's in that document, and there's more extensive information there. I also would like to just take a minute to point out that our public comment period is actually open on CalSafer now. It should have opened at 9 o'clock. And it will be available for you until July 27th, I believe it will close. And we really encourage you, although you're able to provide us with public comment today and ask questions and all of that, I really encourage you that if you have any substantial comments, want us to consider various points of view, that the more information you can provide us, the better able we will be to consider your comments. So when you go, we really encourage the submission of written comments via CalSafer, and we really encourage you to submit any kind of documentation you may have that supports any of the comments that you're making. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to talk to you about whether or not microplastics meet the definition of chemical. I'm going to tell you again, I'm going to tell you how we propose defining them, and then I'm going to kind of explain in a little bit more detail why we're considering this action. So moving on, what are plastics? Basically, plastics are synthetic materials made from a wide range of polymers. Some may contain additives, and some examples are listed here, but there are others. It's been estimated that about 10 billion tons has been produced since 1950. I mean, our plastics really are a miracle of the modern age. I mean, if you think about where they are so pervasive in consumer products. They're everywhere, and it's because that they fulfill functions that they're rather unique in that they're low cost, they're durable, and they provide a function that's hard to reproduce for the same cost, right? So they're found in virtually everything from packaging and food packaging to medical supplies to television sets and computers. I mean, they're everywhere. So microplastics are plastics that are basically small, I mean, on a micro scale, right? There are really two types. There are primary and secondary microplastics. Primary are those that are intentionally manufactured and added to products, right? Secondary microplastics, though, are those microplastics that are generated from plastic products when they break down in the environment. It's thought that secondary microplastics actually make up the vast majority of microplastics that are in the environment, as much as 80%. Let's see here. I'm sorry. I'm not sure which is. Okay, I'm sorry. My computer decided to move backwards in slides for some reason. Anyways, so moving on. So microplastics are these sort of nondescript polymers made up of chemical monomers, right? Polymerized into a structure, but do they really meet the definition of a chemical? You don't really think of a plastic bag as a chemical, right? When you think of that. And in fact, they meet the definition that's in our Safer Consumer Products regulations. The definition was a lot of deliberation and thought went into the development of the definition of chemical that's in our Safer Consumer Product regulations. And the definition that's there was established to provide us as much discretion as possible in being able to identify things that have a chemical makeup to them as chemicals in order to address them through these regulations. And so one of the key factors in the definition of chemical is that it's an organic or inorganic substance of a particular molecular identity. Plastics fit that. And in the case of microplastics, that identity may be described in terms of the particle size or size distribution and surface area. And in fact, its surface area and size that sometimes influence hazard traits. So we are basing our proposed definition for microplastics on their polymeric structure and size distribution. Okay, so this is greatly summarized here. There's more information in the background document, but let me just say that our proposed definition of microplastics is essentially the Water Board's definition. The California State Water Resources Control Board was tasked by the legislature a couple years ago with actually developing a definition for microplastics in drinking water. And they went through that process and they adopted a definition. We are proposing to use exactly that definition with one change. The change is that in the Water Board's definition, they had a lower size limit. So microplastics were defined by them as ranging in size from 5,000 microns down to 1 nanometer, and below 1 nanometer was designated as the nanoscale. We are proposing to eliminate the lower size limit. So we would not have a lower size threshold of 1 nanometer. So we would basically say that microplastics are everything, every plastic that's 5,000 micrometers or less in diameter. And the reason that we're doing that is because the Water Board had sort of a different focus for its development of the microplastics in drinking water definition. And their focus was really looking at drinking water and drinking water safety. They were working on things such as developing water sampling guidelines and so forth. And lower than 1 nanometer, it's really difficult to sample and to analyze for microplastics. At the current juncture, at this current stage of our technology, I should say, it is very difficult to do that. And so the Water Board set a limit of a lower threshold on the size limit of 1 nanometer. And we are proposing to eliminate that because we have seen applications for products that claim to, or we have seen products that claim to contain nanoplastics in them, and they're put there for a specific purpose. And so we don't want to restrict ourselves in not being able to look at products just because they have plastic that's smaller in size than 1 nanometer. That's basically it. Okay, again, our background document has the full proposed definition, which again mirrors the Water Board's definition with that one exception. Okay, so why are we considering this proposal? Well, as I indicated, plastics are everywhere, literally. They're global pollutants. They've been in the media a lot over the past few years. And we're beginning to realize that we've been dumping these things into the environment for a really long time. They've been accumulating, and that their presence there might not be that benign. They might have some potentially harmful properties associated with them. We know that they persist in the environment, and we also know that there's widespread exposure for humans and other organisms. And in fact, it's even been reported that plastics are found in human umbilical cord blood. So moving on. Okay, so it's true that we're beginning to see data emerging suggesting that microplastics, that there are some hazard traits associated with microplastics, okay? However, those hazard traits can differ based on a variety of factors. They can differ based on the polymer type, additives that went into the plastic when it was prepared, surface area. There's just a whole slew of factors that can influence the potential hazard traits for microplastics in general, but there are 2 hazard traits that are actually established in regulation. They're in Chapter 54 of Title 22. And these are hazards, that chapter of Title 22 lists hazard traits that we look at when we're looking at the potential for chemicals to cause adverse impacts. And 2 of the hazard traits listed there are environmental persistence and mobility in environmental media. And almost everyone who looks at microplastics agrees that microplastics exhibit these 2 traits. And so we're focusing just on these 2 hazard traits as part of the basis for our listing. Okay, again, the other thing that we had to consider was exposure, and we know that exposure is widespread. It's well documented. Humans are exposed via inhalation and ingested. We can get it through water, through breathing dust, household dust, air with plastic particles in it. We can eat food contaminated with plastic. I mean, there's so many ways that it can find its way into our bodies. Terrestrial animal exposure is widespread, and aquatic animal exposure is also widespread. So again, exposure is established. So just to summarize before I move on, we are proposing to base our listing of we're proposing to base our addition of microplastics to the candidate chemical list on their persistence in the environment, their extreme environmental mobility, and the fact that there is ample evidence for exposure. So what products can contain or give rise to microplastics? Here's some examples that I just threw up for FYI purposes. It's, again, we haven't picked any particular products yet. We don't have any that are sort of queued up. Gosh darn it. Sorry about that, this darn thing. There we go. But this is just to give you an example of some of the major categories of products that seem to be related to microplastics in the environment. There are others as well. So, and that really concludes my talk. I know it was short and sweet, but the fact is we're only basing this proposed listing on 2 hazard traits and exposure evidence, and so it's not really that controversial in terms of having to elucidate a number of hazard traits or whether or not they contain hazard traits. We're sticking to just those 2 hazard traits and the evidence for exposure. We've determined that they exhibit those hazard characteristics, that there is widespread and significant potential for exposures to MPs for both humans and for animals in the environment. And we think that this is adequate to support our proposed addition to the candidate chemical list. And then just to wrap up, I want to thank these folks here who, Valerie, you're going to hear from next. She's going to give a talk. She's been very active in working in microplastics. Also, Alicia Taylor, who is a staff toxicologist, she helped develop the background information for this proposal. And Dichle is actually here today helping. You probably won't see her, but she's behind the scenes helping out. She's another one who's very knowledgeable in microplastics and who helped a great deal with putting this together. And I think that is it for my presentation. So I will stop sharing and I'm going to turn it over to Valerie Hanley.
All right, can everybody see my presentation? Nobody say no. I'm going to think that we are okay. All right. Thank you so much, Rob. So good morning, everyone. As Rob said, my name is Dr. Valerie Hanley, and I'm a senior toxicologist with the California Department of Toxic Substances Control in the Human and Ecological Risk Office. I provide support to the Safer Consumer Products Program, as well as our site mitigation and our SMRP program. And for the last 2.5 years, I have also been serving as the co-lead for the ITRC, or the Interstate Technology Regulatory Council Microplastics team. And so I'm going to talk to you a lot about that work today. So who is ITRC? ITRC is a state-led coalition. It's run through the ECOS, which is the Environmental Council of States. It has members that are state and federal and industry members, as well as public stakeholders. It's funded through a series of federal grants and then membership fees that are charged to industry members. This is a consensus-driven process, and we develop guidance documents and associated trainings. And today I'm going to talk to you about our microplastics team. So we have been working in 2 different phases. In our first phase, we developed a technical guidance, and that was completed in February of this year. And we also have an associated training, that technical guidance, and I'm going to give you the super abbreviated version of that training today. It is typically a 2-hour online training. And then currently we're developing an outreach toolkit, and I'll talk to you about that some more, but this is a toolkit to aid in educating people on microplastics, not just the public, but also the scientific and regulatory community, as well as decision makers at agency and then also the legislative level. So this is a screenshot of our document. It is a web-based document. It's available at the link above, and I believe someone will put that in the chat for us. The document covers a number of different topics, including a broad overview of microplastics, what they are, where you can find them, why we care. We talk about environmental distribution, fate, and transport, significant things about sampling and analysis, not only different sampling methods and analytical methods, but also the considerations that need to be taken when evaluating microplastics. Contamination is a real issue in this because plastics are in our laboratory products. Our lab coats create microfibers. So there's a lot of really specific ways that we need to analyze microplastics. So that's discussed in that chapter. We talk about human health and ecological effects. We talk about the current regulatory framework, what's happening throughout the country as well as internationally. We talk about mitigation abatement, a big focus on source control, but then also, what do we do once they're in the environment and what technologies are out there at this time to help remediate microplastics. We also have a section on data gaps and future research needs. And we have a number of really nice case studies that deal with microplastics. Again, we do offer a 2-hour training. The link to register for that training that is offered through the EPA Clue-in is down below, and I think it will also be placed in the chat for you. And that training has already been offered twice. Our most recent one was just a couple weeks ago. However, those are archived and you can access them on that website, or if you want to register, our next offer will be in November. So what are microplastics? Rob already gave a really great overview, so I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. But again, ITRC, because there is no one established definition, ITRC looked at a number of definitions that are out there, including the Water Board's definition and definitions being used in the EU and elsewhere. Our definition that we landed on is very similar to the Water Board's and what SCP is proposing today, although we did put that lower 1 nanometer within our definition for the purposes of our document. So what does that size actually mean? We hear 1 nanometer to 5 millimeters, and it's sometimes hard to really visualize what that is. So 5 millimeters is about the diameter of a drinking straw, and a strand of DNA is 2.5 nanometers. So we're talking smaller than a strand of DNA all the way up to the diameter of a drinking straw. So clearly there's quite a range of sizes that are included in this definition. So as Rob mentioned, there are primary and secondary microplastics. Those primary microplastics are intentionally added to products for their use. So whether it's microbeads for exfoliation, or if the industry is making plastic nurdles, which can be used to make macroplastics. In agricultural applications as well, it has sources of both primary and secondary microplastics. Those secondary microplastics come from the breakdown of other products, so such as single-use plastic containers, or even not single-use plastic containers, can break down and create microplastics. Our textiles shed microfibers, which also fit within our definition of microplastics. And then again, tires through their regular wear and tear create microplastics as well. Of course, environmentally, all of these come together and form a milieu of different types of microplastics, and it's not always easy to identify source once they are in the environment. So where are microplastics found? They're pretty much everywhere. This is a conceptual site model that we developed for the ITRC team. It's used within our online document in a couple of different ways. One, to provide overview information, which I'll share that in the next couple slides. And the other is through document navigation. So within our document in each chapter, if you click on one of those dots, it would bring up the different sections of the document that are pertinent to that item. And then it would allow you to navigate to them in the document. So we talk about point and non-point sources. Point sources out in the ocean, we have materials lost and discarded from vessels. We have paint that is degrading off of boats. It's another source of microplastics. We have wastewater outfalls. We have stormwater outfalls, huge source of microplastics in the urban environment. And then, of course, industrial smokestacks also produce microplastics. We have a number of non-point sources, which are particularly important given how ubiquitous we have microplastics in the environment. Kind of the typical one that people think about is plastic trash washing into the ocean and then breaking down and becoming microplastics. But also microplastics can be transported through the atmosphere and deposited far away. So the ocean is actually a pretty big source of microplastics to the land. It doesn't just go one way, it goes both. Additionally, within the household, we have lots of different sources of microplastics, as we've mentioned, toothpaste, facial cleansers, and then activities such as laundering of clothing that produces a lot of microfibers, which are in that microplastics definition. I've mentioned agriculture. We have fertilizer pellets, biosolids from wastewater treatment plants. Wastewater treatment plants do a pretty good job of removing microplastics, but what's left in the sludge and those biosolids, that's where the microplastics are. And a lot of times those are applied to land. And so that's an important source of microplastic in agricultural fields. And then again, that breakdown of tires and road wear particles create microplastics. So why do we care? Again, ubiquitous in the environment. You've heard it a few times this morning, but it's pretty critical. And as Rob said, they persist for a very long time in the environment. They can contain harmful contaminants and additives, and they're consumed by humans and other organisms. And we do know that they can cause adverse health impacts. So in terms of human exposure, there are multiple media pathways for humans to be exposed to microplastics. And as Rob mentioned, our major source of exposure is inhalation, followed by ingestion. And there is some dermal contact with microplastics as well. So we also know that Rob mentioned that microplastics are found in blood. They've been found in lung, in breast milk, in the placenta. So we definitely know that microplastics are found within humans. But it's also really important to note that exposure doesn't necessarily mean that there's an adverse health effect. And while there's been numerous non-human mammalian studies out there, there's a lot of variability that makes it really hard to compare. This is study design. This is what microplastics was used. A lot of these lab studies use polystyrene spheres or something, what we think of microbeads. However, we know that the shape of a microplastic can absolutely impact its toxicity. And there's also the contribution of the polymer itself and any additives that are added. And so that creates uncertainty. There's uncertainty in terms of units and how these data is provided. Are we looking at a concentration of microplastics? Are we talking about a number of microplastics, like a count that was used for exposure? There's lots of uncertainty involved that makes it challenging to interpret this data. And currently, there is not enough information to establish toxicity criteria to use in human health risk assessment. And that's really important when we think about how we can regulate microplastics in our kind of typical way that we do outside of the Safer Consumer Products program, which has a lot more freedom. We do, however, have a lot of information about aquatic toxicity. This figure was developed using some information that's discussed in Mahinto et al., and this is a figure from our ITRC guidance. But we know that particle size plays a huge role in aquatic toxicity, with smaller particles creating more cellular damage. They can translocate across the membrane, cause inflammation, production of reactive oxygen species, and neurological impairment. The larger particle size can cause physical damage, obstruction of the gastrointestinal system, irritation, and then also food dilution, because the fish are feeling full because they have microplastics in their belly and they're not getting the nutrients that they need. So all of this information was put together to form these aquatic risk thresholds by Mahinto et al. You can see on the left side here, and they go from no concern all the way up to the highest concern. And then Scott Coffin et al. Took these risk thresholds that were established based off of the tox criteria or the tox data and paired it with data that's been collected in the San Francisco Bay by the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and basically made this map to show where these different risk thresholds are at within the San Francisco Bay. And the critical thing to see is that we really do have all tiers are represented here within the Bay. We have a number that are in that highest concern that are saying that we need to implement pollution control measures. And so there's clearly widespread microplastics, in the Bay. And this is, of course, just one example. There's lots of work that's been done in the Chesapeake Bay. And I think any bay that you look, we're going to find lots of microplastics. So what is being done? On an international level, the European Union has been working for quite some time. The European Chemicals Agency, or ECHA, proposed back in 2019 to restrict intentionally added microplastics from consumer and professional products. That is currently, it's worked its way through the last number of years through a number of different committees, and it's currently sitting with the European Parliament and Council and is expected to be finalized very soon, and that would ban intentionally added products. So in this evaluation process, there was a discussion, there was a recommendation from the risk assessment, the Committee for Risk Assessment, to remove the lower limit, because we do know that lower microplastics, like I said, smaller microplastics can cross the cellular membranes and are more likely to create a toxic effect. There's still the data, we still need more data to be able to support that in humans, but we see it happening. And so I think there's a real reason to not put that lower limit on it. However, how the EU is actually working on banning these intentionally added products intentionally added microplastics within their products, they ultimately decided to put a lower limit just because they need to be able to analyze the products to make sure that they're meeting the regulation. So at this time, they have a 100 nanometer lower limit, but I think that their plan is to lower that to 1 nanometer as the analytical methods improve. So also, you may have heard about the UN Plastic Treaty that has been working really hard in the last year or so in terms of looking at how we can really globally tackle the plastics issue. And they do specifically call out microplastics in their treaty and call out the need for behavioral change and redesigning of products and improving design so that we can reduce microplastics in the environment. Here in California, you've already heard about both of these bills from both Rob and Carl, but SB 1422 was both of these two bills I'm going to talk about were both passed in 2018. Again, this is where the Water Board was required to adopt a definition of microplastics in drinking water, which they did, which we've adapted here today for the purposes of our safer consumer products listing in proposal to add it to the CC list. They also had to adopt standard methodology to test for drinking water and microplastics. This was some of the first standard methods that were developed worldwide for microplastics. And then they established a requirement for 4 years of testing and reporting microplastics in water. And they're currently in that phase of testing and monitoring. Additionally, there was SB 1263, also passed in 2018, and this was for the development of the statewide microplastic strategy, which was completed last year in February of 2022. They focus on 2 different tracks, the first track being solutions and the second track being science. So recognizing that a precautionary approach is needed, that we need to look at solutions right now. We have enough information to know it's an issue. So let's look at pollution prevention, pathway interventions, and outreach and education. And then track 2 is let's get more science, right? So we can develop those tox criteria so we can figure out what the biggest sources are and figure out how we can best help reduce microplastics. And so I think with SCP's process, we really have the opportunity to affect both the pollution prevention and then also the evaluating new solutions through alternatives analysis process. And then finally, I wanted to mention the outreach and education portion, and this feeds right back into that second phase of our ITRC work, where we are currently developing an outreach toolkit. We have identified 3 different categories or target audiences for our toolkit, one of which is the general public, which these will be aimed at both adults and children, the scientific community. And so in that we include academics and also the regulatory folks like myself and Rob, and then also decision makers. So for our decision makers, we're making documents for our agency heads or our legislative members who we want to talk to about microplastics and why it's important that we continue to look at and regulate microplastics. So that is an ongoing team. You are able to join it if you would like to participate and help develop these materials or just be informed. It is free to join if you work for the state or federal, or if you're a public stakeholder. If you work for industry, there is a fee involved. So I do want to highlight a couple of other teams. Again, here's the link at the bottom for where you can access our active teams. There are 8 current active teams for ITRC. I'm going to highlight a few of them. So of course, our Microplastics Outreach Toolkit. I also want to highlight the Tire Anti-Degradants team, which is being led by Dr. Kelly Grant, who is a senior environmental scientist with the Safer Consumer Products Program. And then also the Contaminants of Emerging Concern team, which is co-led by Dr. Vivek Mathrani, who is a staff toxicologist here at DTSC as well. And that's it for me. So thank you so much. My contact information is at the bottom. I would love for you to reach out with any questions about ITRC or microplastics in general. I'd be happy to talk to you. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Asha.
Great. Thank you so much, Valerie. And thank you, Rob, for the presentations. Now we are ready to hear from you. We do have a number of questions in the Q&A, and we have one hand raised. So I'll just go in the order in which we received the comments. So going back to, I think we received some of those earlier on in the presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and read the Q&As out loud. If anybody has any clarifying questions or add-ons, feel free to raise your hand and I can unmute you if you want further clarification. So our first question is, what is the time frame for the Safer Consumer Products Framework from phase 1 to 4?
Asha, I'll go ahead and answer that question. Thank you for the question. It's a good question. If you remember the 4-step chart I showed at the beginning of the workshop, is right now we're just talking about listing the priority products. That's going to take about a year to go through the regulatory process to do that. Once we do that, then we have to select specific consumer products that contain microplastics for regulation. And then we have to go through another regulatory process to adopt that specific product that we call a priority product in regulation. That takes a year. So we're at 2 years already from now. And once we do that, then the manufacturers that sell the specific priority products into California have to go through the alternatives analysis process. And that can take a couple of years, depending on which pathway they choose. So it can take about 4 years. And then we get to the final step, the regulatory response, which we're just getting into now, which could take, 6 months to a year, certainly there. So it's not a quick process. And that's why it's important that and there's a lot of resources involved on our part and everyone's part. So that's why we take that responsibility very seriously, and that we don't want to pick products that aren't going to be impactful. I will note that one of the things we've seen in the variety of products we've already regulated is that going through this process also stimulates activity in the marketplace, because we shine a light on these issues. And, the reality is manufacturers don't want to produce products that harm people in the environment if they can avoid it. So this is healthy in the marketplace of helping stimulate safer alternatives, to promote innovation, and to encourage people to take action on their own. So, but it isn't a short process.
Thank you, Carl. And I'm going to go to our next Q&A here. This is from Jan Dell. Why are you only addressing products? Mechanical plastic recycling generates massive amounts of microplastics and must be regulated. Scientific studies prove that 6 to 13% of materials ground into microplastics, which are discharged in wash water. California has 7 big PET bottle recyclers and other plastic recyclers. I bet they generate more microplastics than products do. Why won't you include this in your assessment and regulation? Only regulating products won't stop the problem.
Thanks, Asha. I'll take a shot at this one too. Well, good point. The short answer is that we don't have the authority to regulate in our program to regulate anything but consumer products. That was specified to us by the California legislature. We implemented regulations to implement the framework. But I will say that when we pick a specific product, we look at it holistically across its entire life cycle, including its end of life or recycling. So those are the type of factors that we consider when we select specific products, so that if the recycling of a product is problematic, then that might be something that tips the scales for something we might select. And that would factor into what the manufacturers would have to consider in looking at safer alternatives. So for example, potentially, rather than making a product that contains plastic, making one that uses a different material, say metal, that could be recycled more safely, for example. But we're not attempting to say we're going to solve the microplastics problem, which is multifaceted. Certainly, we're just looking at one specific area.
Great, thank you, Carl. I think we'll go to a hand raised here. We've got Luxi Chen. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you and go ahead and ask your question or make your comment, please. You'll have to go ahead and click unmute to be able to speak. Luxi, I see you've unmuted yourself.
Sorry, I think I just accidentally clicked it.
Oh, okay. No worries. All right, we'll move on to our next Q&A then. Let's see. The next one is from an anonymous. Please define what persistent means for microplastics.
I can address that. Persistence is the tendency of a substance to remain in the environment unchanged for long periods of time, and microplastics fit that definition. In chapter, if you bear with me for just a minute, I'm trying to bring it up so I can take a look at it. But if in chapter 54 of the California Code of Regulations, Title 22 defines the persistence hazard trait and describes what the factors are, and basically microplastics meet that. If you, let's see, I apologize, it's taken me just a minute. I'm trying to find the, there they are, California Code of Regulations. Okay. So in chapter 54,
Rob, would you like to come back to this?
yeah,
one?
you know, I'm sorry that basically it's in our background document as well, but basically it's just a tendency for something to remain in the environment unchanged, not to environmentally degrade for long periods of time. That's basically what it amounts to. And specifically for plastics, I can't recall just off the top of my head what the factor was, but it's described in our background document. I can probably find it here and get back to you shortly. So if you want to go on with the questions, we can do that.
Maybe someone can put it in the chat.
Yeah, I can type it in as soon as I find it.
Okay, sounds good. Next, let's go to another hand raised. Joseph Draper. You can go ahead and unmute yourself now.
Hey.
Hi there.
Hi, yes. Hello, my name is Joseph Draper, representing the California Stormwater Quality Association, commonly known as CASQA. As a nonprofit professional member organization, CASQA is dedicated to advancing sustainable stormwater management, protective of California's water resources. One moment. In 2020, Casco adopted its vision for sustainable stormwater management, aspiring for a California that sustainably manages stormwater as an essential component of the state's water resources, that supports human and ecological needs, protects water quality, and enhances and restores our waterways. Stormwater serves as a transport medium for pollutants like microplastics, carrying them from our environment into our water systems without adequate regulation. Without adequate regulation, these pollutants may pose a significant burden on stormwater permittees who must manage and treat them. Microplastics, as highlighted in the proposal document, are particularly problematic. They persist in many areas of our environment and ultimately end up in our waterways via stormwater. In line with our vision for sustainable stormwater management, we strongly advocate and support true source control initiatives that aim to minimize pollutants at their source. Given the substantial threat microplastics pose to our water resources and the larger environment, Casco strongly supports DTSC's proposal to add microplastics to the candidate chemicals list. This crucial step will initiate the much needed control of microplastics at their source, bringing us closer to a more sustainable and healthier environment. Thanks.
Thank you for your comment, Joseph. Next, we'll move on to another Q&A. This is from Aaron Pang. Given how pervasive plastics are, what will be the prioritization process look like for identifying priority products? How broad or specific are the product categories that go onto the priority products list?
Well, I'll start, and then Rob, you can chime in if you want. Great question. I'll allude back to my point earlier that we have what we call the priority products work plan, which is a 3-year work plan identifying categories of products that we are going to focus on during that time for selection for listing as a priority product and thus regulation in our framework. This is, as you heard from Valerie and Rob, there is a large menu of potential products we could regulate. So what we're hoping to do is hear from all of you about what are some of the things that are specific products or categories of products that you think might be best picked by us to be impactful and meaningful to go through this process. And so we don't have a predetermined list yet of specifics. When we come out with our draft priority products work plan, we'll be looking for input on that. And so it's pretty wide open at this point. Rob highlighted some of the types of products that we know of the many that generate microplastics. So the menu is quite large. So we're going to need help helping us get information that can help us sort of evaluate where that spot or spots might be that we can be helpful in addressing this problem through our framework. Not a very satisfying answer, I know, but we encourage you to stay with us on this because we're going to need help getting those questions answered.
Great, thank you, Carl. We'll move on to another Q&A from Cheryl Patton. Microplastics are also released in effluent from plastic recycling facilities, according to a study from Glasgow. Will you be able to address this source?
Again, back to my response to the first question was, we don't specifically have the authority to regulate stormwater or wastewater. We only have authority on products. Some of those products might get recycled. There might be an impact in that pathway, which could come into effect, but specifically not on to a facility or that waste stream.
Great, thank you. Our next Q&A is from Wynn Cowger from the Moore Institute for Plastic Pollution Research. Wynn says, thank you for this workshop. I'm in full support of moving forward with adding microplastics to the candidate chemicals list. I'm wondering what kind of primary research you need us to focus on to advance your understanding of how best to form regulations in this space. Carl, are you speaking?
Oh, I'm sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I think Rob and Valerie are probably best suited to address that question.
Well, I'll give it a go. I mean, I think that in terms of safer consumer products, you know, the requirement for toxicity data is less stringent than for other types of programs. And so that's really kind of one of the large benefits that we have at Safer Consumer Products, is that we don't have to have the same level that you need for setting toxicity criteria that, you know, we would do, say, in the environmental cleanup phase. And so, you know, in terms of Safer Consumer Products, I think I'll let Rob speak to that as to what more we would need in terms of primary research. I think that identifying, I mean, I think really for our program, identifying what those main sources of microplastics are, what are the main products that are producing that. I know that you're very, very active in that world. And so knowing, you know, what's on your radar that maybe isn't on our radar, or maybe it is, but you can provide us additional supporting information. But in terms of primary research, I think just continuing to do the work and getting more tox data. I mean, I would just love that, so that we can start getting some of these other move forward on some of these other avenues outside of Safer Consumer Products.
Well, and let me just add to Valerie's point too, is that as Rob pointed out, we have what we feel sufficient information to list these candidate chemicals on our CC list because of persistence and mobility. But the more information we have, particularly about toxicity and other hazard traits, that will help us refine our focus into which types of products or specific products we might choose for regulation. And as Valerie said, and knowing which those products are, and then getting more information, that will help us sort and sift that bucket, which is fairly large in terms of the types of products we could regulate. So the more information we have on that, that will help us refine our focus to where we think we can be most impactful. I'm not sure if you wanted to add, Rob.
No, I fully agree with everything you said, Carl. And I just want to invite Dr. Calger to, if we don't already have your contact information, to provide it, because yeah, as Carl said, we pretty much have everything we need to support our proposal to list. But moving forward, interaction with institution like yours would probably prove quite fruitful for our consumer product evaluation folks. And I'd love to put you in contact with Ann Cooper Doherty and Christine Papagni, who run those units that do our consumer product evaluations. I think your institute might be able to provide them with some useful insight. So if you're willing to do that, you can either you can put it in the chat, and you can either address it just to me, or you can put it in there and address it to everyone if you want. But if you want to just address it to me, you can do that, and I'll record your contact info.
Yeah, Dr. Calger, you can put your email in the Q&A and we can get it there, or you can email Rob or the Safer Consumer Products email. So one way or the other, we'll get your contact information that way. We'll keep moving through our Q&As. We have a number. This is really great dialogue. So I'm just going to go in order here. And so our next question, ECA Annex 15 provides criteria for derogation based on biodegradability. Will this aspect be included in your program?
That's something we haven't looked at yet. We fully, and we're still looking at it, and we don't know yet. In fact, we've been talking to other stakeholders recently, as well as some other internal folks, and that fact has come up. So as right now, I don't have an answer for you.
But it would not be part of this definition and adding it to the CC list. So that would be something that we would potentially consider once we move, you know, if this gets added to the CC list and we're looking at priority products, then that might be a time when we would look at that. But for the sake of this definition, it would not be included.
Great, thank you. We'll take a few more Q&As and then we'll go to a hand raised. Next one is from Jim Valentine. Are all microplastics considered equally bad from the perspective of toxicology, or is that knowledge evolving over time?
I will take that one. I think that the short answer is the data is definitely developing over time as we are seeing an exponential growth in tox studies that are happening around microplastics. That being said, so far we have seen that, say, things like bioplastics, which sometimes is seen as an alternative, right? We feel better if we're using bio-based plastics. Those also break down into microplastics, and there hasn't been a way, and they create the same toxicological endpoints as other microplastics. We do know that there are certain factors, physical chemical properties of microplastics that may influence toxicity, such as shape and size. So, not all microplastics are created equal because they are a huge mix. But generally, if you're looking at the same size microplastic, regardless of if it's bio-based or, a typical polymer, then we are still seeing that there's similar tox endpoints associated with those. But again, the data is coming fast and strong, and we've really, truly seen an exponential growth in the last number of years. I would like to give a quick plug to TOMEX, which is the Toxicity Microplastics Explorer. That is put together. Dr. Leah Thornton-Hampton is the primary author on that, but it's a really great resource where people can look at aquatic and human toxicity, and it takes all of the studies that have been published so far and puts the data into a single database, and you can create these wonderful visualizations. In fact, I think Dr. Wynn-Calgar was also involved in that. And so I really, if you're interested in this, I recommend you go do that. They're just doing an update of that program, added a whole bunch of new studies in just this past spring. So that's a great place to follow all the information about the toxicity on microplastics.
Great, thank you, Valerie. Okay, our next Q&A has to do with public comment. Given the broad implications of this proposed listing, will DTSC consider extending the comment period beyond the 30 days?
I would like to just point out that this is not the final opportunity to comment on this. This is an initial opportunity. So while we don't currently have plans to extend this comment period past 30 days, understand that there will be many additional opportunities to comment, because where we go from here is to rulemaking, which has its own built-in opportunities for comment. So there will be more opportunities.
And let me just add, you can always give us your input. We're happy to get it, but as Rob said, you're going to have plenty of formal and informal opportunities to do that. So, and the other thing is, when you extend a comment period, people wait till the last minute. So it's just a delay rather than an opportunity oftentimes. So you have the opportunity, take advantage.
Yeah, and please don't hesitate to reach out to us regardless of whether we're in public comment period or not.
Yeah, I will add to that. Please feel free to drop me an email or a phone call anytime. I'd be happy to talk with anyone about this, arrange meetings with anyone, what have you. Definitely interested in hearing from you.
Great, thank you. Now we'll take a caller. We've got Katie Pelch with NRDC.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect, good morning. Thank you for this opportunity to provide feedback on the proposal to list microplastics. I'm Dr. Katie Pelch, a scientist on the toxics team at the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I just wanted to support DTSC's proposal to list microplastics, because in order to protect public health, we do need urgent attention to this emergent threat in order to reduce microplastic pollution. According to the regulation, chemicals may be listed on the candidate chemical list if they exhibit a hazard trait or an environmental or toxicological endpoint. And from what I read in the background document, DTSC has outlined evidence demonstrating that microplastics do in fact meet this definition. Specifically, as outlined in the background document and briefly elaborated here, microplastics are ubiquitous in the environment. They are also mobile in the environment, meaning that they can readily move once they are released. For example, microplastics can travel very long distances from their source, whether that's in the air or in the water. And unfortunately, the breakdown of plastic polymers in the environment is very slow and depends upon the chemical composition of the plastic polymer and numerous environmental conditions, such as the presence or absence of UV radiation, oxidation, the temperature, any mechanical stress, and the presence of microbes that may or may not be able to biodegrade the polymers. In an aquatic environment, scientists have estimated that several microplastic polymers may persist on the order of months to years, only very slowly losing their carbon and mass to the environment. And in the absence of light, UV radiation, these same scientists estimated that the lifetime of some microplastics could be on the order of decades. In soil, even microplastics or plastic products that have been marketed as being biodegradable can last for very long periods of time, greater than a year. So if environmental conditions such as soil temperature are not optimal, these microplastics will be persistent. They will stay there for a very long time. So these three findings, that microplastics are ubiquitous, mobile, and persistent in the environment, means that there are even more opportunities for exposure to occur. And there's already evidence that widespread human exposure is occurring. We heard earlier about the presence of microplastics in lung, vascular tissue, placental samples, and even microplastics in stool samples that have been collected. And finally, we also just heard that the evidence for the health effects is growing. So there's the rapid review of the health effects that was conducted by CalSpec has already concluded that exposures to microplastics is suspected to adversely affect the digestive and reproductive systems based on the available studies. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak today, and I look forward to providing further information and support in written comments that I will submit. And I urge DTSC to approve this listing, as it's an important first step in providing a solution to address the threats associated with microplastic pollution.
Great, thank you for your comments, Dr. Pelch. We're going to move on to another Q&A. What are the biopolymers, bioplastics? How are these viewed? And what about natural polymers, resins, polysaccharides, etc.? Are these thought to be free from microplastic generation risk?
Do you want me to?
I can speak to that. Oh, sorry. Do you want?
Go ahead, Valerie, that's fine.
Okay. So we do know that, as I mentioned previously, that bioplastics can and do produce microplastics. In terms of other polymers, there is we do have a clause in the definition. Rob, maybe you've got the definition in front of you that you can speak to, but natural polymers that are created in nature are not considered to be part of a microplastics. So let's say things like amber, I think is a good example of a natural polymer. However, we can certainly continue to look at things as the science develops about where we do find microplastics, but we do know that bioplastics do in fact create microplastics.
Great, thanks, Valerie. We'll move on to another Q&A. Next one. There was a recent study from England stating that the process of recycling itself causes large quantities of microplastics. If or presuming that is true, how would that affect any of the legislation proposed?
Well, let me clarify that what we're talking about is regulation and listing microplastics on our CC list. If you're alluding to anything that's in the California legislature, that's really their bailiwick, and you'd have to talk to them directly about that. But if you're asking if we would consider some of these things in our process, if we select a priority product for regulation under a framework, we look at the entire life cycle of those products.
All right, thanks, Carl. All right, next, we're going to take another Q&A. This is from Molly. For microplastic contamination from paints, marine coatings were mentioned, but are you also using the paint umbrella to include architectural, meaning interior and exterior or industrial paints? Or will you limit the language to specify the evaluation of marine paints?
I'll speak to this just because I think this was my slide that mentioned marine paints. That's just one of the places that microplastics come from. We have not identified any products within Safer Consumer Products at this point that we would be pursuing. I think that paints could potentially be a product that we could look at. And I think that all paints do create microplastics. And so I think that that could be something that we could potentially look at. But as has been mentioned a number of times, we don't have any priority products in queue to look at this time.
Right, thanks, Valerie. Okay, moving on to our next Q&A. Since most microplastic research to date has been with materials such as spherical polystyrene, which is likely to very minor percentage of environmental microplastics, what is the plan to have more realistic test materials, such as typical polyethylenes like polyethylene?
I'll just say, I think it's outside of the scope of what we're talking here today with safer consumer products. I do think that there is a lot of work being done in looking at other types of microplastics within the research community. But again, we're looking at just adding microplastics to the CC list. So that's kind of outside of our scope that we're talking about today.
All right, thanks, Valerie. Okay, moving on here. Next is from Aaron Pang. Can you list multiple priority products for microplastics simultaneously, or does it have to be done one at a time?
Short answer is yes, we can. We've done it in the past. We did that with children's products that had foams containing flame retardants. We named specific types of those products. We can do that. The key there is, though, you have to look at it from a practical standpoint of, are the products both similar, and can we put the number of products through our process in a manner that we have the resources to deal with and that would be appropriately impactful. So we consider all those things. It's not just that we can do it, but should we do it? So I'm not sure if that completely answers your question, but
Yeah, if you have a clarifying question you want to add on, feel free. Otherwise, we'll just keep moving on here to another couple of Q&As, and then we'll take a hand raised. Next one is from D. Wilkie. Have you considered adding PIP, pour in place, used tire crumb playground surfacing to your point sources, like synthetic turf that used tire crumb playground surfacing using tens of thousands of used car and truck tires? Mindaru has done studies on migration from playground. Research from South Korea in 2020 showed that children who play on PIP surfaces have 10 times the greater risk of developing cancer than those who play on soil.
well, quickly, again, you're leaping a little bit ahead to looking at specific products. Right now, that's outside the scope of what we're doing. We're looking at listing microplastics, but certainly would be interested in hearing more information about this as we move forward and move towards selecting specific priority products.
Great. Okay, next Q&A. U.S. Plastic Pact has a problematic materials list where oxo-degradable additives are called out as problematic. The idea here is that certain additives can accelerate microplastic formation. Is there a known list of these substances? Is DTSC looking at this?
The short answer is I don't think the DTSC is looking at this time. However, we will certainly look at additives when we start looking at different products and what additives were used in the development of those products. That would certainly be within the scope of what we would look at when we would evaluate those. But I would love personally to have more information on that. So I will certainly follow up myself and look into that.
All right, thanks, Valerie. And then we'll take there's a quick point Molly wanted to make. Also, are marine paints and even industrial paints considered consumer products, as these products not meant for general consumers?
Yes, they are. The reason is because we looked at the definition in the statute, which basically says that anything in commerce in California is a consumer product.
All right, thank you. And now we'll switch over to a hand raise from Andrea Ventura from Clean Water Action.
Hi, can you hear me?
You sure can.
Okay. First of all, on behalf of Clean Water Action, we do want to express our support for this listing. Obviously, we are looking at microplastics from an aquatic persistence and quality lens, and we think this fits beautifully into our need to protect both our drinking water sources. We also work extensively on surface water pollution and the effects that that can have on subsistence fishers and various cultural practices, particularly amongst our tribal communities. So the concern about microplastics coming up through wildlife and into humans, very important. I have a couple of two just quick questions. One is, I do understand very clearly that you are looking at putting this listing so you can evaluate products in the future. I'm clear on that, but I'm a little confused as to whether in the public comments in writing, are you also looking for recommendations on products to either prioritize in the future or to not. For instance, the state of California did pass a law some years ago that ratcheted down on microbeads in personal care products. So maybe you wouldn't start there. So that's my first question. And my other question relates to someone just mentioned the list of problematic chemicals or substances in plastics. I know your focus is on environmental persistence and mobility, but will you also be looking at, and I also understood the lack of full understanding on some of the toxicological aspects of this, but will you be also considering plastics that contain known toxic chemicals like PFAS or PVC? So those are my two questions.
Okay, so first of all, on the product recommendation, the first part of your question, we want you to submit anything you'd care to submit at this point. We are not in the product evaluation phase, but we're always interested in hearing input. So we would definitely be interested in that. And as we get into, if this moves forward and comes to fruition and we start evaluating products, that would be another time that we'd be very likely interested in talking to someone like yourself and your agency about things like that.
Okay.
So I hope I answered that. The second part of your question, though, I'm sorry. Can you repeat the second part of your question one more time?
Yeah, can you still hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. I understood that you're not specifically doing this listing based on toxicity, but would you be looking when you're picking products at toxicity issues around things like PVC, PFAS, or other toxic chemicals that may be in the plastics?
Yes, absolutely. So what we're talking about using the mobility and the persistence for, as you noted, is just adding this to the candidate chemicals list.
Right.
When we move into product evaluation phase down the road and are looking at products with respect to microplastics, we can look at other hazard criteria and other hazard traits as well that may be unique to the microplastic or that we're looking at.
Okay.
So we can consider those kinds of things that may be more specific to certain types of microplastics at the time we actually get into evaluating those microplastics within the context of products.
Very good. Thank you.
And let me just add, thanks for your questions, Andrea, that, we appreciate that it takes time and energy and effort to formally comment. So I would encourage, if the time that you want to spend, great. But when we get to the rulemaking phase, which we're not in yet, it's probably best to just focus within the scope of that rulemaking. That will save you time as a commenter and us time too. But we'd love to get all that information looking forward. So, but again, thank you. And we just don't want you to spend too much time that we're going to have an opportunity later on.
All right, thank you all. We're going to move on to our next Q&A. Right, so how do you even test for the propensity to shed microparticles? Are there test methods available? And are they even close to real life, as most of microplastics happen after degradation during use and environmental exposure?
I will take that. I mean, again, I think I would say that this is outside of the scope of what we're talking about today in terms of adding microplastics, but just from my experience, I think there are some methods. Specifically, I can think about tire wear particles. I know that there are some simulations where they look at shedding of particles from tires through tire use that I think do a pretty decent job of evaluating the shedding that's happening. And we do have a lot of products that are that have primary microplastics. And so those, we have a better idea, obviously, of the concentration of microplastics that would be in there.
Thanks, Valerie. Okay, let's take a couple more Q&A. Rob, did you have something to add on to that?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, great. Let's take a couple more Q&As, and we've got a lot of great dialogue here, and we've still got, it looks like, a number of Q&As to get through. It looks like 25. So I think I will give the panelists a chance to take a bio break at 10:30. Does that sound good, Rob? Just for a couple minutes?
Sounds fine to me, Asha.
Okay, great. And so we'll just, I want to keep the dialogue going, and we do have until noon, and we want to hear from, you, and we want to take advantage of, of having this time carved out. So just want to make sure that we give folks a chance to step away midway in. And since we have some good, robust dialogue, we'll just go ahead and take a very short break at 10:30. So we'll keep going with the Q&As here. So next one is from Gabriel Prindle. What matrices would you test for microplastics? Drinking water, soils, aquatic, wastewater, blood samples, all of the above? What methodologies and or instrumentation would you use?
So I can take that. I mean, I think that all of those things can be evaluated. Safer Consumer Products would not be testing any of these samples to look at it, because that's not something that we do. But those are all different media that you can look at. I did put a link in your question, but I can put it in the chat too, to our sampling and analysis chapter in the ITRC document, which goes into detail about different sampling methods, analytical methods, and we have a great sampling tool that you can use to try to determine, how, what might be the best method for evaluating different environmental media for microplastics.
All right, thanks, Valerie. Okay, next Q&A is from Nick Lapis. He says, thank you for taking this on. Can you clarify how an alternatives analysis would work in the context of intentionally added plastics that don't have a functional purpose, like ones added for aesthetic purposes? And he's with Californians Against Waste.
Well, let me just say on that, that's getting ahead of ourselves a little bit in terms of the AA process, but in our process, the manufacturer determines the specifications that for their product. So I think the manufacturers who are intentionally adding those things might, argue that those are important to their product. And so it points out that some of these things come down to people's values. And so, aesthetics are valuable in the marketplace to some degree for some products. So that would be something that could be considered in the AA process.
Thanks, Carl. Okay, our next Q&A. Is there currently an understanding as to what's the best metric for evaluating toxicity of microplastics? Would it be size of the particles, surface area, aspect ratio, or something different?
I would say it is all of the above. There's a lot of information that's needed. There is, again, I will kind of continue to recommend people to check out the ITRC microplastics document, as there is a lot of information within our sampling and analysis section. I know that we do link to when Cowger has who commented earlier, has a really great checklist of what he recommends everybody include in their studies so that they can be easily evaluated and compared to other studies. So I would recommend that you look at that, and I'll see if I can get the link and pop it in the chat.
All right, thanks, Valerie. Our next Q&A is from Megan Ebach. She says she joined late. Sorry if you covered this. Is PLA and other bioplastics considered microplastics in this research?
I think they're capable of creating microplastics, yes, and microplastics created from PLA could be included in our definition.
Okay, moving on to our next Q&A. Can you speak at all on DTSC's position on microfiber filtration for clothes washers? The current most recent proposal is inadequate in addressing industry concerns around, number one, standardized test method for efficacy, and number two, impact on water energy consumption, and number three, impact to consumer, and it trails off here.
We don't have a position on microfiber filtration per se. We haven't done any research into that yet. We're aware of certain suggested solutions like that people can employ to reduce the amount of microplastics they reduce during clothes washing, but we haven't actually gotten involved with that in any way, and it's not within the scope of this discussion either, to be honest.
Carl, did you have something to add on?
Sorry, I was muted. I think the question might be related to, there is a bill in the California legislature that addresses this to some extent. We don't have a formal position on that bill. You're welcome to talk to the author's office about your concerns there.
All right, thank you. Okay, let's see. Okay, we already did Megan's. And next, we're going to move on to Jim Valentine. Will there be different levels of threat assigned to microplastics based on the time frame of their persistence in the environment?
This is the way this question's worded is a little bit. I'm not sure I'm answering it correctly, but during our evaluation process, when we evaluate products and chemical combinations, we can take into account any information that's available on various hazard traits, right? But we don't necessarily have a ranking system in place that says this plastic is worse than this plastic because of this or anything of that nature. So we're unlikely to rank things. We're instead most likely to do research supporting one position or another, whether or not we list, whether or not we propose to list a priority product based on the hazards related to the candidate chemicals that we're looking at within that product. So I hope I've kind of answered that in an indirect way. If not, you can feel free to clarify or expand your question. I don't know if Carl or Valerie have anything to add to that.
Okay, great. Okay, it looks like we're at 10:30, so we'll just take a very quick break here. Let's just do a couple of minutes. So we'll be back at 10:32, and please keep the questions coming. Okay, everyone, welcome back. We'll continue on with our Q&As here. So the next one is from Andrea Ventura with Clean Water Action. Says, just to be clear, you do want comments on products that might be regulated in the future?
Sure. Well, we'd love to see them. That's a little outside of our focus right now, but the sooner the better. If you have time and interest, we'd love to see them.
All right, great, thank you. Okay, next Q&A. How do you balance the impact of microplastics with overall sustainability measures such as LCA studies? For example, if tires generate significant microplastics, but the alternatives have much worse environmental impact, how will these options be weighed?
Well, again, this question is focusing in the part of our process, which is the alternatives analysis phase, where we do take a life cycle thinking approach. And so everything in our experience is about a trade-off. So there are, very few things, whether it's tires, personal care products, where there's an easy alternative that there's no impact somewhere else along the life cycle. Our process accounts for that. We require the manufacturers to demonstrate and measure that and make recommendations on that. And then ultimately, if we disagree, we can impose regulatory responses. That's a short answer.
Great, thank you. our next Q&A. Are you considering what the materials are that go into these products? Your slide on where microplastics originate have several product categories that could be made out of many different materials. So shouldn't the impetus be on regulating the single material that makes up all of these? For example, petrochemicals?
Short answer is we regulate products and the chemicals in those products, not the the petrochemical industry writ large. I think it's a good point, but that's outside the scope of our authority.
All right, thank you. Moving on to our next Q&A. How can we effectively determine the contribution levels and pinpoint the sources of microplastic accumulation and migration in the environment, given its long-term presence and widespread distribution? And how can we use this to establish product categories? Will you provide recommendations for standardized methods?
Well, I think the short answer, and maybe Valerie or Rob can chime in, is that we'd love to see suggestions on that. We don't need to have that level of specificity to certainly list these microplastics right now, but as we look at specific products, it would be helpful information.
All right, moving on here. Our next Q&A is from Kathleen, and she says, please address plastic synthetic turf fields. One of the largest single point sources of microplastics pollution, other than landfills or recycling facilities. Studies have estimated they shed up to a ton of plastic fragments per field per year, and even more granulated tire waste into air, soils, and water.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. I think we've mentioned in previous workshops that we are looking at the possibility of looking at artificial turf as a priority product. And so we've been looking at that internally, and we hope to maybe have a workshop on that later this year. Also concurrently note that the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment and CalRecycle are engaged in a risk assessment looking at human health impacts of turf fields, but we're looking a little more broadly than that. So we would certainly consider that information when it gets published.
Great, thanks, Carl. Our next Q&A is from Dilpreet Singh. When you refer to the entire life cycle of plastics, do you also plan to include end-of-life degradation in a landfill or incineration facility?
Short answer is yes. I mean, again, back to the trade-offs, it is important to us in our framework that we look at every phase of both manufacture, extraction, and during the manufacturing impacts on workers, the use phase, and ultimately end of life, whether that's in a landfill, recycling, incineration, whatever. Those are all on the table.
Right, great, thank you. Our next Q&A is from John Rohr. Is there a Cal EPA state recognized standard method for sampling for microplastics in indoor air?
No, is the short answer. There is not.
All right, short and sweet there. Okay, our next Q&A. Do you anticipate that the California motion will influence the federal approach to addressing the issue of microplastics, and how you see regulation impacting import of products into California? Considering transboundary waters and pollution exchange, would there be action to ensure cross-boundary pollution control?
Yeah, good question. Couple of things. One, US EPA is looking at microplastics. I think they have out for comment their microplastic strategy. I'd encourage everyone to look at that. We have a very good working relationship with US EPA, a memorandum of understanding that highlights that we will collaborate and coordinate and share information on safe and sustainable chemistries. And as Valerie pointed out, the work that ITRC is doing across states and across a lot of different partners, industry, academia, et cetera, also is supported by US EPA. So there's a lot going on, a lot of information. So, but keep in mind that we all have our own separate and distinct authorities and responsibilities. So that patchwork of focus and work, hopefully we'll move things forward. And the second part of the question was, I don't see the question anymore, so I don't remember. Sorry. I don't know if anyone
Let's see, I can get back to the second part there. Okay, so, and how you see regulation impacting import of products into California?
Yes. Well, certainly a challenge for us is, we can only regulate things that are sold or offered for sale in California. That does include imports. Part of the challenge with that is, how do you enforce those our regulations for entities that are outside of California? And that can be challenging, particularly if they're outside the United States. I'm happy to say with our recent augmentation in budget, we are growing our program, and actually Rob Bruscia, who presented today, is the head of our compliance and enforcement unit, and we are working to figure out the best ways that we can both assess and ensure compliance with our regulations. And we're doing things like reaching out to the border Customs and Border Patrol and other avenues that might be available for us to make sure that people are following our regulations.
And there was actually a third part to the question. Considering transboundary waters and pollution exchange, would there be action to ensure cross-boundary pollution control?
Well, again, our regulatory authority ends at our state lines. That said, we do work cooperatively with other states. As I mentioned, Valerie talked about ITRC, but we're working on a memorandum of understanding with Oregon and Washington. And we work with a lot of other work groups that have state members like ECOS. So I think collectively, to the extent we can, we try to share communication, we try to share information that creates as level playing field as possible, both with us, other states, and with EPA.
Right. Did you have something to add, Valerie?
Well, I would just add that, since California is such a huge state and a huge part of the economy, I do think that manufacturers want to be able to sell things in California and everywhere else. So a lot of times our regulations will absolutely influence, manufacturers, and so changes happen, because they want to be able to sell their products in California. And as I'll just also add, as Carl mentioned with ITRC has members from all 50 states, 2 territories, US EPA, and other federal agencies and international folks as well. And so we really are, and again, I co-lead that ITRC microplastics team. So we really are in touch with, across people, all over the world, really, in terms of these issues.
All right, thanks, Valerie. Moving on, our next Q&A is from Conrad. Based on previous entries on the candidate chemical list that have worked their way through this process, can you comment on how many items typically make their way into the top of this funnel? And then how many end up coming out of the bottom of the funnel, being formally regulated?
Great question. Thanks, Conrad. The funnel starts out broad and gets very narrow, and it takes time and energy. We've regulated only 6 priority products to date, and more in the pipeline right now. And we're getting faster on that. But certainly the vast majority of things that we look at don't make it through the process for one reason or another. Either we find that there's not that specific product chemical combination isn't one that fits once we get enough information, it really isn't a good candidate for our framework. Other reasons are that perhaps the California legislature, jumps ahead of us and takes action which preempts us from doing that. That was the case in food packaging, fiber-based food packaging containing PFAS, where we did a lot of work, good work, and the California legislature looked at that and then jumped off of that and moved to certain restrictions, which is probably where we would have ended up. So there's a lot of work that goes into the upfront assessment of potential products. And that's why it's really important, this engagement that we're having today, just on the list, but down the road that we're going to be asking you for when we look at specific products, because we need good information because our resources are very limited. So we want to focus our efforts on things that are going to be impactful.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're moving on to our next Q&A from Sophie. Nordstrom Zellebrand has a line of activewear made of Reprieve, a polyester made from recycled plastic bottles. Do you foresee these types of textiles with circularity in mind being as heavily regulated as other polyesters and synthetic fibers?
Interesting question. I think, the jury's out on that. We'd have to dive a little deeper into that area. I mean, I think many folks are talking about the circular economy and what's happening in the EU. Those are really good points. They're also very complicated and include a lot of factors outside the scope of our authority and ability. But there's important things to consider. So certainly we'd be looking at that, and we might find that in that case, if that circularity was happening and it wasn't a good candidate for our process, we would spend our resources elsewhere.
All right, thank you. Okay, we're gonna move on here to Kathleen. Per synthetic turf, the European Union is at least moving to ban granulated tires as center of carpet infill, a source of plastic and microplastic pollution. Can we move to that in California?
I would say our first step is adding microplastics to the CC list. And once we get this added to the CC list, then we can potentially start looking at products. And I think that is certainly something that we could potentially look at. But this is our first step in being able to move towards that. Yeah,
Valerie's point is certainly spot on here. I will add that this is a good example of why the alternatives analysis process from our perspective is valuable. Is the assumption is that there are trade-offs. So if you're not putting in a turf field, you're putting in probably a grass field, and all of the use of pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, and water that go along with that. So is the trade-off in terms of health and the environment better or worse with turf? That would be the question that we would assess. And I don't think we know the answer to that yet.
But the alternatives could be that you use sand for the infill instead of rubber. So those are all the kinds of things that gets evaluated in that alternatives analysis.
Absolutely. Good point.
I wanted to add that that we are not, our primary purpose isn't to ban anything. It's to encourage, it's to work with stakeholders and manufacturers to try to find safer alternatives for the use of some of the hazardous chemicals in these products. So we wouldn't move right to a ban anyway. We would move to looking at the product and characterizing it, as Carl and Valerie said, and moving on with information that we gain through that process.
Very true.
All right, thanks all. Moving on to our next Q&A. If a material is biodegradable, would it by definition fall outside of persistent material?
So I can speak to that a little bit, and then I'll let Rob or Carl expand. I think that there is a lot of considerations in terms of if something is biodegradable or not. I think part of it is, you have to have really specific conditions for that degradation to take place. And so I think as a program, we would really need to be looking at that as we move forward into our product categories as to if a product that we're looking at claims to use biodegradable plastics, under what conditions does that occur? Do we know how complete that degradation is? Because without those very specific limits in place, it makes it harder to regulate because something can degrade. I think for a long time we thought, okay, well, plastics, the whole point is they degrade and then we don't see them anymore. That's okay, right? And then we realized, oh, now we've created all these microplastics that we can't see with the naked eye anymore, but they're clearly having, some adverse impacts. And so I think that's just something that we're going to need to really evaluate as a program as we move forward. And it's certainly been brought up to us. And the EU does have those standards in it. So I think that's something that we would look further into once we're naming products. I don't know if Rob or Carl wants to add to that.
I don't have much to say or much to add. You answered very well. Yeah, I would just say biodegradability and persistence are not necessarily mutually exclusive terms. what's more important is how long something stays around. So just because of the fact that it's biodegradable, how long does that take? And like Valerie was saying, is it complete? Is the material in question completely biodegraded? Are there remnants of it left around? Those are all things that we have, no way of answering or addressing at this point. We'd have to look at that in terms of the research that we do when we get to that point.
Right, thanks, Rob. Right, we're going to move on here to our next Q&A. The California legislative bodies have been proposing microplastics regulation for the past couple of years. How does that work with DTSC's proposal?
Well, a couple of levels here. With the specific proposal we're talking about today, it's not really relevant, I don't believe. We're using our specific regulatory authority to propose adding microplastics to our CC list. On the broader scale, the California legislature has their unique and authority and responsibilities, and they use that in a variety of ways. When a bill comes up that directly impacts us, we analyze that, and we work with members and staff to analyze those bills. Moreover, if you go back in time, the genesis of this program was that the California legislature recognized the importance twofold of having really good science and work up front on addressing some of these chemicals and products issues. That's why they gave us the authority, and they also recognize that they want to avoid regrettable substitutes, which sometimes are a result of chemical whack-a-mole legislation, which is like, we're going to ban BPA and baby bottles, and then they're going to use BPS. So, but it's not that simple, right? The devil's in the details. So, and I would point to the bill that the legislature passed with banning certain food packaging having PFAS in them. And that was based on a lot of the work that we did. And that, I think, was probably a good outcome. But, it's generally complicated, and we look at bills when they come along, and we give our technical input, and we work as best we can with the legislature to protect California and Californians.
All right, thanks, Carl. Moving on here to the next Q&A. Would you know of any study researching microplastics from disposable diapers and other related products?
I don't have a specific study to point you to, although certainly microplastics are generated from baby diapers. And then in fact, there's been microplastics found in poop of babies in diapers, but it's also in meconium, which is that first poop babies take when they're first born, because we know that it crosses the placental barrier, and babies can be born with microplastics in their systems. So we do know that is the case, but I don't have a specific study to point you to, but I'll see if I can find some articles to put in the chat for you.
Great, thank you, Valerie. We're going to move on to our next Q&A. If size and shape are most important in toxicity, why is something like amber excluded? It can shatter to micro-sized particles. Why distinguish natural versus man-made?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think we can stop amber from being, created environmentally. I don't know if that's the best answer to your question. But I think your point is valid and something to consider. I think that those natural polymers are excluded from most definitions of microplastics. That might not be a satisfying answer, but I think that's all I've got.
Yeah, if you'd like more, feel free to open up your mic or raise your hand or send us another Q&A. So we're going to move on to our next Q&A. Do you consider emulsion polymers to be microplastics? Emulsion polymers, acrylics, and vinyls are aqueous fluids containing submicron spherical polymer particles.
You know the answer to this, Valerie? Because I'm not sure of it, to be honest.
I do not know the answer, although reading what you've said, I would think that it would be. I mean, if they're a polymer, and they have submicron spherical polymer particles, I would think that that would fit within our size definition and our definition of microplastics. So my guess, without being, would be that yes, that they would be included, but clearly that's not something that is immediately on our radar. But we would love more information. If you want to submit a comment and tell us more about these particles, then we would, be happy to hear that.
Great. Looks like we're getting to the end here of our Q&A, so we just have a couple more. So encourage you to, provide us with additional feedback. We do have more time allocated here, or raise your hand if you want to, speak to us with this time that we have carved out. So I'll carry on here with our next Q&A from D. Wilkie. Actually, the OEHA study, still not complete, began 2015, only looks at the used tire crumb in synthetic turf playing fields. I believe Dr. Kathleen Mitchells is referring to the plastic carpet, backing, and shock pad.
Asha, can you read the next one too? They're related, and then I'll address them.
Sure thing, yeah. Okay, next one, the trade-off is not pesticides and natural grass. The trade-offs organically managed natural grass fields. Please do not repeat the disinformation perpetuated by the petrochemical plastic synthetic turf industry. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, on the first one, yeah, I know. Let's be clear: is that CalRecycle and OEA have their perspective and their study, and it's very specific and based on their needs. Our needs are slightly different and more broad. So when we say that we're going to be looking at artificial turf, we're holistically looking at that, and that includes a lot of different variables and factors, including such things as the potential use of PFAS in the manufacture of the blades, not just the infill, but the backing, etc. So we look at these things very holistically, and but we do need, if we get good information on pieces of that whole product, then that's really helpful. In terms of how I cast the AA, I was just making a general point about how we look at AA. Let's be clear, is that process is very detailed and comprehensive, and would not just look at, as I said, water, pesticides, fertilizer, but also the potential for using organic fields, but also, as Rob pointed out, the potential to use something other than Krog rubber as infill. The other potential of there's many factors that need to be considered in an alternative analysis that our regulations require. So it is a complex and many layered process, and I don't mean to jump to a conclusion, which we wouldn't do before that work actually was done.
All right, thanks, Carl. Okay, the next one is a request for us to post the comments while I'm reading them. So I'm gonna flip how we've been doing it. I'm gonna go ahead and publish it first, and then I'm gonna read it out loud. So for the panelists, you'll have to go to the answered tab in order to view those at the very bottom. Scroll just to the very bottom. So let's carry on here. Okay. So, and I'll have to do the same thing. So this time I'm just going to go ahead and say that we're answering it as we speak, and I'm just going to scroll down to the bottom. So thanks for bearing with us here. Emulsion polymers are used in almost all water-based coatings and paints, both for industrial use and consumer use.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. And we have actually been talked about some of those polymer coatings, and yes, those would fall into the category of microplastics, is my understanding. So thank you for that added context.
Okay, great. We're going to move on here. And this is another one from Kathleen. Let's make sure I've got it here. Bear with us. Okay. False dichotomy offered in the discussion between grass, which is intrinsically chemicals and microplastics, free unless they are applied, which is not necessary, versus synthetic turf carpeting, which is intrinsically a chemical and plastic waste producing synthetic material. Also, synthetic turf needs water to cool and clean, and she's provided her contact information. Definitely encourage you all to share your contact information with us so you can stay in touch or sign up to our e-list. And definitely, please feel free to email us at Safer Consumer Products. All right, so it looks like we've got 3 more Q&As, and we'll just keep, it's nice to see the questions and comments continuing to come in. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and put this out there so you can read it. And this one is from Usha. From properties to toxicity, comparing microplastics to other airborne microparticles. Author links open overlay panel, Simon Wieland and the other authors listed here. And then there's a reference to this particular, there's a link here for reference.
Thanks, Usha. I think this is specifically answering that question about if there are methods, which I shortly said that no, there was no Cal EPA standard method, which there's not. But I think this paper that Usha has provided the link to does talk about some methods for evaluating in air. They just aren't standard Cal EPA methods.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to our next Q&A. On the topic of biodegradability, if microplastic is anything below 5 mm, would definition of biodegradable plastic be impacted?
Let me see. Did you? Okay, hold on. I'm reading the question.
And I can read it out again.
I'm just thinking about it for a second. I don't understand the context of the question. We don't have biodegradable in our definition, so I'm not sure if going below 5 millimeters would alter that. Valerie, do you have any thought on this?
Well, I think the question is just that because our definition of microplastic is anything below 5 millimeters, right, you know, is what we consider biodegradable actually biodegradable? And, you know, as Rob said, you know, biodegradation is not part of our definition that we're proposing for adding microplastics to the CC list. Clearly, it's something that we will include and evaluate when we move into our product categories, when we start looking at when we start looking at products and naming priority products. At that point, then I think we would start looking at biodegradation, but it is not part of our current definition that we are proposing. If you feel that very strongly that it should be included, those are the kinds of comments that I guess that we would welcome during this period of time, just with substantial background, hopefully, so that you can really support that technically, so that we can evaluate that and determine if that seems like an appropriate change to our definition. Those are kind of the perfect types of comments to hear during this phase of adding microplastics, adding microplastics to the CC list.
Great, thank you. And for the commenter, if you wanted to, you know, raise your hand and provide any clarification or additional comment, please do feel free. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next Q&A here, and it's from Andrea with Clean Water Action. Okay, so just a reminder for those focused on turf, this is something the legislature is looking at this year. Great, thanks for the comment, Andrea. Okay, moving on to our next Q&A. I've got some contact information. Sophie says, thank you for your answer. And it looks like we are at our final Q&A here. Let's go ahead and put that out. Okay. So our very final comments here. Okay, will the public comments be posted for viewing? Yes, we can absolutely make that available. We'll have the Zoom files will be available, and we can compile those and post those as well as part of the public record, along with the recording of this meeting.
Asha?
Yes.
The public comments are entered into our CalSafer website, and they will all be tabulated and available there for
Okay.
viewing once we publish them. So once we get them in, we have to review them for confidential business information and so forth. And then we release the parts that are not confidential, and anyone can go in and access and look at the comments that we received.
Great. Thank you for the clarification, Rob. And let's do a final call for any additional questions or comments. I'm not seeing any hands raised, and it looks like we've got a few more here. So, all right. So from D. Wilkie says, thank you. Let me go ahead and post this first. All right, thanks for bearing with us for this, making sure you all can see it as they come in. All right. Wilkie says, thank you. And we're tuned into the bills in California legislature as well as other states. All right. And we're going to move on to our next Q&A here. This is a good question. Are informal calls and emails to Rob also get shared?
Well, the short answer to that is no, we don't post all of the informal communications we have. I mean, obviously, if someone wanted to request through a Public Records Act request, we would provide everything that was relevant, that wasn't confidential business information, or subject to protection. But no, this is one of the reasons we encourage people to make a formal comment so that comes into our CalSafer web portal so that everyone can see it. And that helps continue the dialogue. So, but yeah, obviously, if you call us and that's not recorded and put into a public document.
Great, thanks for clarifying that, Carl. Appreciate it. Okay, we're going to move on. Yes, this is great. We've got additional Q&As coming in, so we'll keep things going here. All right, our next Q&A. Would gaseous or particle emissions from plastic raw materials used by consumers in 3D printers be important for assessment of microplastics?
The short answer, I guess, is that well, gaseous wouldn't be if there's not particles, because those wouldn't be microplastics. Not that they aren't important, but they wouldn't be defined as microplastics. If there are particles made through 3D printing, polymers absolutely could be included in the definition of microplastics. It is included, would be included within the definition of microplastics. So that, you know, could be something that we could look at moving forward.
Great, thank you. Okay, moving on to our next Q&A, and this one is a bit lengthier, so let me go ahead and post it so you all can read along here. Okay, next one, just for clarity, biodegradable plastics can potentially break down into smaller fragments, including microplastics, under certain conditions. The term biodegradable refers to the ability of a material to degrade and then return to nature, but it does not necessarily mean that it will completely disappear or not produce any microplastics during the degradation process. The extent to which biodegradable plastics contribute to microplastic pollution depends on various factors, such as the specific type of plastic, environmental conditions, and the degradation process. Some biodegradable plastics are designed to degrade into smaller particles and eventually biodegrade into natural elements. However, if the conditions for complete biodegradation are not met, such as proper temperature, moisture, and microbial activity, the plastic may fragment into microplastics as needed. Right, and yeah, thank you for your comment. Let me make sure I've got caught up here on the ones that we have addressed. Okay. Okay, there's a couple that we received that we responded to here. Nastron says, not sure if this has been answered before. Will textiles, including glitter, be classified as priority products? Is glitter considered microplastic? We have, Dishlai has responded. If anybody would like to provide additional content, please go ahead.
I guess I can just add to that. I mean, glitter is considered microplastics, yes, but for the purposes of this workshop, we are proposing to add microplastics to our organic chemicals list, and we will be looking at products, if this gets adopted, that specifically contain microplastics based on the 3-year priority product work plan. So that's how we define our product categories to look at some of those in the future. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Dishlai. Okay, great. And our next one was had to do with our distribution list. Okay, so let's see. We have, it looks like one additional Q&A, and the rest are related to our email distribution list. Okay, let me go ahead and post this. All right, next one is from Natalie, and let's see here. Bear with me for one moment. Okay. Wouldn't it be important to include biodegradability because of the possibility for microplastics to break down to nanoplastic size? And from my understanding with smaller particles like asbestos, for example, particles with greater surface to volume ratio are more likely to cause damage if inhaled.
I can say that we are not excluding nanoplastics currently. They're included in our definition. So I'm not completely sure what's being suggested here. Biodegradability, as we've said before, is not part of our definition. At this point in time, we don't plan to make it part of our definition. We already capture plastics at the nano size by our definition. So
if I could, Rob, I think the reason Natalie is bringing it up is because there's been a lot of questions about trying to align with the EU, that I assume are getting at aligning with the EU in terms of the biodegradability clause that is in their Annex 15, which was cited earlier. And so there's been some discussion about that. As Rob said, as I've said, it's currently not in the definition. I imagine that we will be getting comments based off of the comments we're receiving now that people will propose that it is. I think that I think that your comment, Natalie, is right on. I think that those are our important considerations. And so I guess I would encourage folks to also submit comments if you think that we should not include that as part of our definition, then I think that that would also be helpful and with appropriate technical defense as to why you don't think it should be.
Great, thanks, Valerie. It looks like we have one last Q&A here. So let's go ahead and post this. Okay, and it looks like our final Q&A is from Terry. Apologize late to the conversation, but will microplastics from artificial turf be added to the list? To date, AT is covered in PFAS chemicals too.
Yeah, we're not adding plastics to the list in the context of a particular product. We're trying to capture all microplastics. So the answer to your question is yes, they wouldn't be particularly excluded. And as long as what you're referring to in terms of your artificial turf, as long as it meets our definition of plastic or microplastic, it will be included.
Great. And no worries if anyone's late to the conversation. We're happy to take any questions or comments that you have. Even if you join late, please, we do have the time and we want to use this time to engage with you. Good. We've got a couple more here. Keep them coming, please. I'll go ahead and post this and let's see here. Okay. All right. In our next Q&A, biodegradation doesn't need to be in the definition, but would come up in the hazard traits as less persistent and maybe less hazardous.
Yeah, thank you. That is exactly right. And exactly, I think Valerie alluded to that earlier when she said we would consider such things when we were doing our product evaluations down the road. And that is exactly the place where we consider things of this nature.
Great, thanks, Rob. Okay, we've got one more in the Q&A. Let's go ahead and post that. And please keep the Q&As coming. It looks like this is our final one. How early do you anticipate the list of priority products, including microplastics, to be finalized?
Well, that's
Go ahead, Carl.
good. Well, that's a good question. I mean, right now we're just talking, let's be clear, we're just talking about adopting into our candidate chemical list the class of microplastics as a chemical on our candidate chemical list. That then allows us, after that's done, to focus on specific products that contain microplastics as a priority product, which is another step in the process, which typically takes 10 months or more, or a year. As I alluded to earlier, we're in the process this summer of putting out our draft priority product work plan, which will talk about the categories that we're looking at. Assuming we're moving forward with microplastics, you can anticipate there will be categories in that work plan that include types of products that might generate microplastics. So, I can't tell you the end date, and there may be more than one priority product with microplastics potentially. So, but the first step to doing that, we can't get there until we change the candidate chemical list to include microplastics, which is what our intent is today. And so we appreciate all your input.
All right, great. Oh, good. We have another Q&A. Excellent. Let me go ahead and post this. Okay. How multi-components product would be assessed if one part is plastic and can shed microplastics? Would microplastic be observed as a toxic substance, and other regulations can impact it?
This is a kind of a difficult question to answer specifically, but generally speaking, we consider a product as a whole. Now, for certain assembled products, that they are addressed in our regulations, and we could address a component of that product. Your question doesn't provide me enough details to answer definitively on how we would assess a multi-component product, because it depends on the specific details. What product? How is it comprised? How, what are the components of the product? How is it sold in the market, and so forth? But generally speaking, when we address a product, we address the whole product. So if a part of a product is responsible for containing the candidate chemical, that still doesn't necessarily mean we wouldn't address the product as a whole. But whether or not we would address that specific component or the product as a whole really depends on a variety of factors that I don't have any way to assess at this point in time. It gets into the product evaluation process when we're evaluating products in the context of the candidate chemicals.
Great, thank you, Rob. Moving on to our next Q&A, we have a few more. This is great that we've got more coming in. I'm going to go ahead and post it. Okay. Can you summarize again what information would be helpful to include in written comments?
Yes, anything related to the proposal that we're discussing, whether you support it, whether you don't support it, whether you think we should revise it in some way, we're interested in any and all comments related specifically to this proposal. I think Carl alluded earlier that we aren't necessarily searching for suggestions for products to look at right now because we're not there yet. And so as the most efficient use of your time, you may want to focus on the addition of microplastics to the CC list. And if you have ideas for, ways we might revise the definition or other positions you'd like us to consider, it's really very helpful if you provide us with enough supporting background information to support your position so that we have something to evaluate. I hope that's helpful.
All right, great. Thanks, Rob. Okay, moving on to our next Q&A. And before I do that, just want to thank everyone who's providing us with their contact information. Okay, going to post this next Q&A. We have a couple more in the Q&A, so please keep it coming. All right, so our next Q&A. Let's see here. Bear with me while I make sure I don't miss any. Okay. How can the 2024-2026 work plan include microplastics before the listing of microplastics on the candidate chemicals list is complete?
Well, the work plan describes the product categories we're going to evaluate. And so it would not necessarily include microplastics per se. It would include a description of the product categories that we'll evaluate. And some of those product categories may include products that we would be looking at with respect to microplastics. Okay. The work plan is just now being developed as coincidence would have it, right at the time that we're putting this, we're trying to move this proposal to add microplastics to our CC list forward. So they're kind of overlapping. And in that way, we're not excluded from putting things in the work plan that may relate to microplastics, but because the work plan is not even going to be finalized probably until towards the end of the year, at which time if we move forward with this, we'll be long into the rulemaking process and so forth. So that's kind of how.
Well, yeah, and let's be clear. I don't think there's any legal or regulatory reason we couldn't include we have in the current work plan our interest in looking at things that generate microplastics. This is a guidance document essentially, and it's an opportunity for people to give us input about which categories they think we should look at, and for us to tell people the categories we anticipate looking at. So our primary focus here is being transparent and clear and making sure that we do work that's well supported. So as Rob pointed out, we can make it work indirectly, or we can just be more direct and say we anticipate that we are going to be listing microplastics, and if they are listed, we might identify certain categories. So it's a dialogue in some sense, and it's not I don't think there's any legal restriction that would prevent us from doing that. So.
And I'll just add to that, initially, one of the ways that microplastics first came on our radar, which was, probably 5 years ago now, was when we were scoping food packaging. That was part of that priority, part of that work plan. And so in scoping food packaging, we realized that the production of microplastics was something that, we wanted to look at. And so I think that there are lots of things that aren't specifically microplastics. So polystyrene, for example, styrene is on the candidate chemical list. How our definition of chemical is, technically we could potentially look at polystyrene. We didn't pursue that at that time due to a variety of reasons, but just wanted to note that we have lots of ways that we can get to looking at things that produce microplastics.
And to Valerie's point, I like to say that, chemicals follow the laws of nature, not the laws of man. So, we're not going to split hairs on this. And we just want to be direct and clear and transparent.
Great. And I think there was some clarification requested from Rob's answer. If there was a draft work plan up for comment too, and I believe Dishley went ahead and provided a written comment there.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I said that it's in development and a draft work plan is being developed to release later this summer, as Carl had indicated early in his talk. But I didn't mean to imply that it was already ready and out there. It's not.
Okay. Thanks for that clarification. We got a couple more in the Q&A. Let's go ahead and post.
Hey, Asha, if I could just remind everyone, I put it in the chat, but yeah, if you're interested in hearing more, please do sign up for our e-list listserv. The link has been provided in the chat, and it's also in the slide presentation. That's a great way to get announcements on all of SCP's events, activities, whatever. So I highly encourage you to do that. You will get notified when the priority product work plan draft comes up for public comment as well.
Okay, great. And it looks like, okay, we had a Q&A that I posted, and now I'm just looking to find where that is. So if, just making sure that we didn't miss anything. So I think I posted one, but we didn't get to it. So if anyone sees that, please do go ahead.
I know what it said, Asha. I can, the question was asking if plastic containers, I believe is what it said, would be, or plastic packaging would be added as part of this. And again, we're just adding microplastics to our CC list. That is a product that we could potentially look at once microplastics are added. If we wanted to look at plastic packaging as a source of microplastics, if we wanted to name that category, that could be something that we could look at. But we're not currently, that's not what we're currently doing. We're currently just looking at adding microplastics to the CC list, and the products will come at the back end after the process, after rulemaking, and we go through and we decide what our priority products would be that contain microplastics.
Great, thanks, Valerie. And for the commenter who put that in, go ahead and feel free to add on to your comment and or raise your hand if you want further clarification. It looks like we have one last Q&A here in the queue. So let me go ahead and post that. Okay. All right, I'm just making sure that we are not missing anything, and I moved a couple over and I'm not seeing them. So if anybody else has tabs on that, please do read it off or respond.
I can summarize. I think the question was, would the listing make companies who already have produced products that have microplastics in the environment accountable or responsible? The short answer is no. Our authority only relates to people who are selling products into California and that process from there. So it doesn't impart any liability for past sales or exposures.
Okay, great. Okay, so it looks like we've got, okay, so I'm just going to read this one out first, and then I'm going to post it so I don't lose track of it. Thanks for bearing with us here. What adding microplastics impart microplastics already in the environment? I'm just reading it verbatim here. Would this open opportunity to keep companies responsible for already existing microplastics? So I'm going to go ahead and post that one so you can read that. And if
that was the one I was trying to answer.
Exactly.
And again, let me just stipulate, I'm not an attorney. That's not a legal analysis. Certainly people are welcome to pursue any of their legal avenues as they see appropriate or fit. But
great. All right. Well, thank you. Just wanted to, okay, we do have a hand raised. Excellent. Okay. Jamie, you should be able to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Very sorry. I tried to put it down.
Oh, was that inadvertent? Okay. All right. No worries. Okay. Do we have any other questions or comments? from anyone in the Q&A, or anyone want to raise their hand and speak to us? Otherwise, I think, I just want to thank everyone for such great dialogue. This has been really wonderful. And I'm just going to pass it back to Carl for closing comments. I'm just going to do one last final check here, Carl. And it looks like we have covered everything. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Asha. Yeah, let me echo Asha's appreciation for everyone's participation today. It's super important for us to hear from all of you, both your questions and your comments, and learn from your wisdom and experience. And so I'm thanking you ahead of time for your submitting written comments in our comment period, and staying engaged with us as we move, not just through this listing process, but also as we move into the selection of priority products following this process. And let me just say that also includes things beyond microplastics. We have a lot going on, and you can look at our SCP timeline on our webpage if you want to look at the variety of different types of products we're looking at. And as you see on this slide, just a reminder that the public comment period runs for the next month. Please use that, and it's very helpful for us to get specifics. Remember to say, if you have an opinion or a recommendation, please back it up with your rationale and any data or information you can. And then there's look at the background documents on the web page. Please note that we will be making a video of this available soon on our web page, and that it's really helpful if you want to sign up for our Safer Consumer Products e-list that will keep you apprised of the activity we're talking about today, but also the upcoming webinars and workshops and other regulatory actions that we take. And so that's really important that we hear from you, not just today, but in the future as well. I also want to do a shout out of appreciation to our staff here at DTSC who make this all possible. Today, I especially want to thank Asha and Ashley for their help getting us prepared and for facilitating this workshop, and to our speakers Rob and Valerie, as well as all the team on the back end that we didn't see, including Deechle, Hannah, and Paul, who make this happen, and the rest of our team who works day to day in doing this research, working with all of you to advance our mission to help make California and Californians safer from hazardous materials and in our consumer products, and promote innovation and safety. So with that, I thank you very much. I also want to just note, we're in the process of hiring. Any of you who are interested in joining us in our mission here at DTSC, we're hiring scientists, engineers, toxicologists, and more. And you can go to these links or look on our webpage where we have information on what we do, the positions we're hiring for, and that, as well as within the greater Department of Toxic Substances Control, who is also looking for great folks too. Our mission is challenging, but it's super important, and we need really good people. So I think that's the last slide. Is that right? And with that, thank you so much. We'll look forward to hearing from you all and talking with you in the future. Appreciate it.